everyone, welcome back again to my telling of history of Almorda and what is centered around the lands of Ordia that I have here, actually. Yeah, if you guys haven't checked out my other couple videos that are basically based on the history of what the series is all about, because this fantasy series is my current biggest project. I would say my biggest writing project is the Lands of Ordia, as it's going to be a 5-book fantasy series, and there's a bunch of history and lore that kind of goes behind it all, and this is basically me telling all about it. The other two videos that I've done for this basically goes back into the creation of the world itself of Almorda, and also the cause and root of how and why evil is in Ordia and is kind of like spreading, like this darkness spreading. So that was kind of like the first couple episodes here, and I'll be continuing this series of the history of Almorda until I get to the end of the notes, and then I'll be reading my book, which is hopefully that'll be maybe next year that I'll start reading the actual book. So for now, it'll be me telling about the history, so you guys can kind of have some references if I ever get to reading it. So the last time we actually led off was the basically like the fall of Telekor and the reason why basically like a bunch of like demons were involved and the orcs were created and stuff like that. But we actually shifted back to Ordia because the unfinished lands were sunk into the sea by Elevendel, because he saw how much evil was in that land. So now we pretty much kind of shift back to Ordia, where it is the awakening of the firstborn, secondborn, and the exploration of Ordia. So here we go. Once each Ordian race was ready to be awoken, each leader of the race would cause one of the population to appear on Earth in the form of a golden mist, taking the shape in which their thought had crafted them to be. The first few among the first beings were able to see this transformation, therefore revering the Tenalin and the Alumnar, and have full faith in Elevendel, as well as the Alumnar and the Tenalin. But they had still not taught them yet of the evil of Telekor. The first beings to be awakened were the fairies, in 515 SD, which is solar days if you guys missed it, in Faeruna, the far-off island that no one except Elevendel knew of. Their island was not known until the fairies from Elevendel entered Ordia and told stories of their ancestors. This oral tradition was kept alive and was very important to the fairies to have their history remembered the way that it was. It wasn't until about the mid-Second Age that they arrived in Ordia to fight against the Second Darkness. The second beings to be awakened was mankind in 518 SD, being the ones that were first fashioned after the fairies. When they awoke, they saw the land before them was very habitable and had potential of a good start to a new settlement. This is where Mason Rokine would be settled. There was another attempted village nearby, but it failed almost 12 years after the settling. The third beings in Ordia were the elves in 521 SD, who were awakened in a thin wood near the Korlag forest, where Eltorium would be. They immediately took to nature and the wonder of striving and learning and keeping new and old things in their community. The fourth beings were the dwarves in 524 SD, who were awakened in the southern lands of Aliceville, close to a tall and mighty mountain line, which would soon be named Menkin, meaning mighty. They were very adaptable to the cold weather and found a place to settle on their own, where Kala's Tour is. When these four races of Ordia were awakened, the Alumnar appointed the mortal leaders, naming them the Valanra, leaders that would be passed down to solely serve their race so that they could survive. The decisions were then to be made by the Tenalin in the upcoming years to choose this Valanra. And the first four Valanra were Enrios, the protector of elves, Renal, knight of men, Galzalan, berserker of dwarves, and Ilnia, child of magic. The second-born included gnomes, changelings, and Alistani, or also known as wizards. The Tenalin were hesitant in their awakening, but they still chose to go forward with it. They were all awakened at once, each at different places in Ordia. The gnomes began in Avlin, a land of rolling hills and lush fields. They were instantly entranced in their land and barely ever left their hills. They adopted a life of kindness and humble actions, staking hills for communities rather than establish a single spot. The changelings were made in the Korlak forest and had a sense of paranoia and panic almost right away. A few of them were able to make it out of the forest and survive, but many went back inside and never came out because of fear of the open lands. The Alistani began in Karug Dulag, but did not stay for long. Many of them were of mankind, so their strife for more knowledge and curiosity sent them all across Ordia. They only stayed during the first few years to gather their mindset and make sense of where they were. There were hesitations also on if the Alumnar were to appoint Valanra upon the second-born, but ultimately they decided it would be unfair for them not to have one. The three Valanra of the second-born were Tilia, Maiden of Gnomes, Mordron, Duke of the Alistani, and Cathorlok, Matron of Changelings. During the years of 520 through 532 SD, many of the main travel roads would be established, and therefore the races were able to meet each other for the first time. It was mainly mankind and dwarves who carved and made the long roads, and their alliances were strong when they met first. The elves occasionally helped with the roads, but spent more time exploring with their own kind. There were no quarrels or fights during this time, but there were tense feelings because of the many differences between all of them. Defenses were made strong in the main city of each race while also sending off scouts for possible future settlements. Each Denalan helped with building the communities and establishing allies between races and cities. The first years of settling was both up and down, but ultimately resulted in a very proud people of Ordia. The race of mankind traveled the furthest among any of the races of Ordia, and were the first to reach the southern and western borders of the ocean. Together with both the three Valanra of the races and an embassy of elves and dwarves, they settled Tolvia in 547 ST, the first city to be built by three races. At the south, with the help of the Valanra, Renal, they established Korog Ilig in 551 SD, and at the western side they established Pelagoth in 559 SD, though they didn't build it up close to the coast because of the dangerous tidal wave that washed ashore. Later in 583 SD, they established Belif to the east of Korog Ilig because of strange rumors on the more eastern coast, past the Algard ranges. The race of elves did not venture too far south, but sought to be near the coast. Eltorium was their first home, but once they established Tolvia with mankind and dwarves in 547 SD, they also traveled with mankind towards Pelagoth, but decided to settle many miles south at the border of the Eltrum forest and named it Malia, establishing it in 564 SD. After realizing this was done, the Valanra Enrios led them straight east on the now-made Tiok road connecting from Mason Rokine to Aliceville, until they reached the coast. There they made Inti in 592 SD. There would be no more elven establishment, for they revered the number of three as divine, since Alavendel made the three Alumnar as the first beings. The dwarves did not settle anything except for Kala's Tour and part of Tolvia, where the dominant race was in fact dwarven. In Tolvia, the Valanra Galzolan stayed there for a long time to ensure peace, mainly with mankind, for the elves began to return back to Altorium after just a few years. Rather, the dwarves were known as almost nomadic people, despite the majority never really leaving Aliceville. Caravans and traders would normally roam through Zaphithia, the country of Zaphithia, and the country of Mulanti, and occasionally into the country of Salmoria, but rarely made it to the southern coasts. The gnomes would begin their thriving in Avlan from 527 SD, of their awakening, to 560 SD. They were fearful of the outside world because of their size and their few population. They began creating communities and villages across the hills of Avlan instead of one specific city. The Valanra Tilia helped mainly with tending the fields and expanding the crops, making Avlan a very plentiful land. It wasn't until 562 SD that they began to venture outside of Avlan for trading and allies, beginning first with Belif and Koragi League, eventually leading to Vase in 575 SD, and Mason Rokine in 580 SD. The Alistani only had one settlement they claimed as their own, in Velin, in 603 SD. They were considered the most nomadic people and eventually became known as vagabonds. They mostly went along with mankind as they resembled them the most, and took part of the building and crafting. It was the idea of Valanra Mordron to settle in between Inti and Velen, and chose the spot where Thracion would be. In Threlonk, they added mankind with establishing Thracion in 614 SD, and made allies with Inti in 623 SD. This helped them in the long run with trading in between Velen and Inti, and it was the reason why in the Second Age it rose to great wealth. The Changelings never officially had a settlement that would be called a city or a town. They were very druidic in their ways, staying mainly in the Korlak forest, but eventually ventured through Zephythia, Mulanti, and the northern regions of Dal. It was in Dal that a fortress was built, and ultimately where the first vampire of Ordia would dwell. Some changelings retreated into swamps in Mulanti and southeast Zephythia, and others would go into the Algard ranges into deep caves or into the Golden Ranges near western Salmoria. The fairies would not enter into Ordia until the later years of the War of Shadow, around 727 SD. Even then, they stayed on the island of Orgoth for the most part. There, the Valanra Ilnia would go into battle mainly for being druidic and having immense healing abilities. The fairies' involvement would be a huge factor in the last years of the war with this certain trait. Orgoth was their new home, and the people of Ordia let it be like that. For fairies, this island was similar to Elevandil, their second home. Near the end of 578 SD, contaminated mice, rats, bats, and even some squirrels and insects were considered poisonous after a large group of people were bitten in Vase and fell seriously ill with aches, fevers, and ultimately 75% of them died. Some of the vermin ended up on caravans with wagons and carts and made their way as far as Tolvia, Pelagoth, and Mason Rokine. Many cases of this plague were reported after 2 months of 579 SD and continued in these three cities until 582 SD. Infirmaries were filled to the maximum. Houses were left crowded and the streets were bare. In Tolvia, the vermin plague wiped out nearly 3% of their population. In Mason Rokine, it was 5% of theirs, but the worst was in Pelagoth, where 12% of their population died. It was mainly because the city was built in the middle of prairies, fields, and a thick portion of the northern Eltrum forest near to them. The vermin plague was the first disease which had a significant impact on Ordia as a whole, but a plague was not the worst of what Ordia's fate had. War loomed ahead sooner than they expected. And I think I actually kind of had a typo here. Instead of 85% of them, I think I had 8.5% of them died. So, my bad. So, in Vase, it was actually 5.5. Or, oh man, wow. 8.5. I didn't read that point there. 8.5% of them. And then it spread from there. That's actually kind of all I have for this one, because the next episode is going to be probably long. As it is going to be the War of Shadow that was mentioned. And yeah, it's kind of like the exploration of Ordia, so it's not like battles and stuff like that. That's not until the next episode, actually. So, but it's kind of like how hopefully, actually, I have some images of the map that I hand drew, basically all the regions and cities. So hopefully I can get some images up on the screen so that you guys can kind of like figure out where all the cities are at, and just some like images of where it's at from like by the rivers, by the mountains, the borders, stuff like that. And I did forget to mention here, in the way of making countries, they pretty much follow either a river line or a mountain direction. So, but like I said, the exploration of Ordia is definitely a good thing to kind of like go over, because of all the allies that Ordia as a whole definitely is fighting against Telekor. Because this actually happens, even with the exploration of Ordia, there's actually some, I guess you could say skirmishes, not really like wartime, but definitely orcs and goblins are still in Ordia. They're just not as, I guess, like not as a massive population for like actual war. So, if that makes any sense. But that's kind of all I have for this episode. Not too much to really talk about. It's just kind of like the Alumnar telling the Tanalan to appoint their own mortal leaders, which is the Valanra. So the Valanras are pretty much not so much kings or queens, but they're just kind of like the representatives of, elves, mankind, dwarves, gnomes, things like that. So they're kind of like the representatives are the Valanra. and the Tanalan were the pretty much the ultimate leaders of the races itself at the beginning of time, I suppose. So they're the ones that are pretty much the messengers between their own race, elves, dwarves, stuff like that, between them and the Alumnar and ultimately Elefendel. So I just thought it would be good to kind of explain it a little bit. But yeah, that's for the last time. That's all I have for this one because, like I said, ultimately I'll be writing a whole separate book on this, and it'll go much more into detail. This is just the condensed version. So I think with all that out of the way and all my rambling just done for now, yeah, just hopefully you guys will stay tuned for another episode. If you have any questions about the history and lore and whatnot, I would gladly listen and comment and reply back. But yeah, let me know if you guys like anything about the history of Almorda so far, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.